this is where the Druids come in, because the Druids were the guiders, the guardians of the moral/spiritual path. And of course, they served a priestly function. They deployed magical powers, according to legend, by incantations, and had the ability to foresee the future and to predict the outcome of events. The Druids were skilled healers with a wide knowledge of the therapeutic properties of plants and herbs. They were also educators and guardians of the sacred knowledge via the oral tradition. Remember, the Celts were prescripted from writing down their sacred knowledge in their own language. They also had a considerable knowledge of astrology, astronomy, and the skill of calendrical computation. Now, according to the ancient legends, the Druids had the power of shape-shifting. They could change shape, and they were also able to change the shape of another person, or take on the shape of others themselves. They could turn human beings into animals or birds. Their spells, their magic, were practiced in a position reminiscent of a crane, standing on one leg, with one arm outstretched and one eye closed. This technique was known as the Koringan Ktat, which translates to crane wounding. Now, the crane, of course, played a sinister role in Celtic mythology and religion. The Druids' magical powers were also employed during wartime. Druids and chanting bards would come between armies lined up for battle, charming them and magically avoiding combat, creating a type of Druid fence or Druid force field. And any warrior leaping over this force field, this Druid fence, was killed instantly. The presence of a Druid could also ensure victory in a battle for the weaker side. Now, the Druids were in fact a threefold order with different levels of training involved. It took 20 years of training to become a Druid. 20 years of training in order to know the will of the gods and have the ability to communicate directly with them. A Druid, as I mentioned, was adept at astrology, medicine, magic, education, and legal expertise. They were philosophers, in fact, with sacred knowledge. The second of the threefold order was the Vates, which took 12 years of training in order to gain the power of prophecy and become the masters of poetry. Then you have the Bards, which took 7 years of training, composers of poetry and satire. The Bards had considerable power and status. Satire was a type of weapon of words that could cause physical harm, illness, or even death. The bards could call words into existence. Now, oaths sworn before any of the threefold order were considered sacred and legally binding. An oath was given a type of sacred magical moral power by these moral guardians and primary priests, who were integral to rituals, ceremony, and sacrifice. Now, let's get to sacrifice here a minute. Animals were slain for rituals and sacrificial purposes by the Druids. Dogs, cats, bulls, cows, horses, pigs. 3 animals at a time. Of course, this is linked directly to the sacred number of 3. The Druids would eat of its flesh, drink the broth in which it had been cooked, and sing a spell of truth while wrapped in the hide of the slaughtered animal. Now, pigs, which is a highly intelligent animal, was the primary choice for sacrifice and ritual consumption. Pigs were linked to the sacred knowledge that enlightens. Now, animal sacrifice was much favored by the Celts and Germanic tribes as an insurance policy and form of divine protection. For example, one animal was ritually slain in order to prevent or preserve the flock or herd from disease. In fact, we must give the gods their due. We must propitiate the deities. The reputation of the ancient Celts for indulging in human sacrifice comes from Greek and Roman writers, such as Julius Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus, and Poseidonius. Now, these Greco-Roman writers claimed that the Celts, the Druids, would plunge sacred daggers into sacrificial victims or burn them alive inside a wicker man. The Druid priests would then divine from the death throes of the human beings, or search for prophetic signs in their entrails. This, of course, was augury. Human sacrifice being practiced by the Celts it's certainly possible, but we don't really know for sure, although recent archaeological evidence certainly points in that direction. Now, human sacrifice in religious matters was practiced all over the Indo-European world. So the question is, why did the Greeks and Romans single the Celts out? Why did they single them out? Well, the answer is that the Greeks and the Romans had an agenda. They want to denigrate the Celts with propaganda. The Romans wanted to demonize and dehumanize them, make them less than human, transform them into bloodthirsty animals. Well, ritual killings were in fact a way of Roman life. For example, you had gladiatorial games which occasionally would end in the death of one of the gladiators. Didn't happen often, but it did happen. It was rather expensive, so it was a rarity. But you also had, more importantly, ceremonial executions by the Romans, ritual strangling, ritual slaughter at the foot of the Capitoline Hill in Rome during the finale of a triumph celebration. Now, a triumph celebration by the Romans only happened about every 10 to 15 years or so, but a ritual strangling was an integral part of the ceremony. So, why are the Romans singling them out? Because it's propaganda. Now, surviving Celtic mythological literature has no tradition of human sacrifice. The material, of course, was not written down during the pagan era, but much later by medieval Christian clerics. Now, these clerics, in my opinion, would have taken the opportunity to denigrate the pagan Celtic beliefs of their ancestors if such a practice of human sacrifice existed. These Christian clerics probably would have placed it under fierce attack in their literature. So we don't really know if the Celts practiced human sacrifice. All right, which Druids were the specialists and supervisors in Celtic belief and practices, binding the gods into making reciprocal gifts to humanity, including spiritual insurance against divine hostility. Rituals were centered on cult sites, secluded locales, sanctuaries, and sacred spaces linked to astronomical observation. Lakes, groves, pits, rivers, mounds, peat bogs, wells, springs, etc. Watery places were popular with the Celts. The Celts would place votive offerings. This is known as the custom of deposition. These items were then carried out into the earth, through which the gods and goddesses could be reached in their other world. Nematon, the sacred grove. This is a clearing or grove with a small chapel or shrine. Lots of trees from which were suspended gold, silver, and iron leaves and fruit, decorated with intricate patterns. Now, springs and lakes, well, these were types of natural sanctuaries without enclosure or protection. High-valued metals, gold and silver, along with weapons, coins, jewelry, and tools were thrown into these sacred waters. This was, in fact, a type of divine vault, a type of depository for a sacred treasure. Magnificent horns, decorated with intricate patterns, have also been found in these springs and lakes. Usually, well, we've also found the highly valued skull or head of a respected person has also been found in springs and lakes. Let's get to bogs, which were also filled with metal deposits, as well as human sacrificial victims. Now, these victims may have broken a taboo. Their transgression warranted death that would, well, condemn them in this life and in the next. It's a threefold death involved here. Axe, garroting, and a cut throat. A triplification of death, which was a type of binding of the soul, confusing it so that it could not reach the next world, trapping it kind of in limbo between this world and the next. Their bodies, the bodies of these victims, have been beautifully preserved in the peak mud, and many bodies have been found over the years. Now, islands were favored as a cult site by the Celts. They were often served by female religious specialists linked directly to the island location. An island is a physically bound sanctuary, and the priestesses were, of course, virgins who are sexually bound. The island is surrounded by water. It's a boundary and ready-made enclosure. Soil, water, virginity were linked in a conceptualized form, the island sanctuary. All right, wells and sheds.